Welcome to Atomic Life. I'm Kurt Havens, and today we are back with Nicholas Weir. What's going on, Nick? How you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, finally got a good podcast mic, so hopefully my audio isn't archaic anymore.
So today we were going to talk about the difference between 90s bodybuilders and the current guys, like Nick Walker shown here in the slide, and what our thoughts or assumptions are on their cycles, possibly their diet or the training, just what kind of the differences were, because they clearly are bigger now and their shape is definitely different than what the guys in the 90s were like. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, like obviously there's a big visual discrepancy between the 90s bodybuilders and the current ones. And I mean, one of the common claims thrown around by a lot of people, at least what I've heard, is that everybody thinks that conditioning was better in the 90s and that they have a lot more size these days, but they lack the conditioning. But I mean, I think we could probably argue that a large impact or a large reason for that is the fact that our cameras have gotten a lot better. I mean, the video cameras that they used to use back then versus now, the actual cameras they took photographs with back then versus now are completely different. And that would have had some sort of an impact. The lighting was also different. They used obviously probably or abused diuretics a lot more back then than they do these days. And so there are factors to keep in mind. And also just I honestly think it's just, I suppose, a bit of a biased view. Like, I don't think that the bodybuilders of today are necessarily not as lean. I think it's just, yeah, a lot of changes in smoke and mirrors. But in terms of size, like, they've definitely gotten bigger. I think bodybuilders have gotten a lot bigger these days. And the standard for what is considered normal is a lot higher. Like, the benchmark is set a lot higher than it was in the 90s. But I'd argue, and I think you agree with me, that the genetics were probably better. Like the actual gene pool of bodybuilders back in the 90s was superior to today. Like, we're getting people who maybe are making up more so with milligrams and just training methods and diet approach versus relying more on genetics and just kind of throwing anything at the wall and seeing if it sticks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it started obviously with the beginning of bodybuilding, right, in the 50s or 60s, what the silver era, or the golden era. The gene pool was really small, right? There was only a handful of guys that were successful, guys like
Yeah.
Arnold and Frank Zane and stuff, and they had to rely on food, genetics, and what was available. Right in the 70s, there was basically two or three doctors in Southern California that were writing prescriptions for things, or they'd go to Mexico and get what they could. And, all the way into the 90s, the guys that I've spoken to, certain things like Parabolin, which was really the only easily available form of Trenbolone on the market back then, was near impossible to get. They guys would buy it when they could find it when it came into the US, but it wasn't always around. And same with Mastron. I talked to a lot of guys that from that era that said that they would use Mastron if they could get it or they could afford it, but it was mostly a European thing at that point. And so it wasn't always around. So these guys would, both for their off season and their preps, they would use what was available to them and in quantities that they could afford, right? Same with growth hormone. What was at least what most of these guys talk about in the 90s, they would use 2 or 3 units of growth. That's all they could get. That's all they could. I mean, it was supposedly it was massively expensive. I don't have any personal experience in the 90s with that, but a lot more expensive. And I think things were a lot harder to come by versus, at least in America, you could get within reason anything you want. Your wallet's almost your limit, right? Obviously there's a genetic factor, but I think that it's just much easier. So you can get an average guy in a gym, if he has some money, can blast grams of gear and, a bottle of growth hormone and get to at least a somewhat competitive level versus, when Ronnie Coleman and Flex Wheeler and those guys were around. I just don't think that was the case.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the accessibility is a lot better these days. I think all around the world, but specifically in certain countries like America, Canada, and certain European countries, Northern European countries, I think being able to, I suppose, access the drugs easier has played a big role in the reason why we are seeing a lot of bigger mass monsters these days. and specifically the growth hormone, like you said, because I've spoken to a handful of, I guess you could say, vetted bodybuilders over the years. There's a few back in Australia that I knew quite well who did compete actively in the 80s and the 90s. One of them actually did go international and compete in a few shows. And they used to always talk about how growth hormone was so hard to obtain back then. And yeah, like you mentioned, if they could get hold of it and if they could use it, it was sparingly. It was usually for contest prep only. And they would run, yeah, anywhere from like 1 to 4 IUs. That was all they could afford a lot of the time due to the scarcity of it, and then also the cost, because I mean recombinant technology back then, as you know, like working in the field you work in, was in its kind of infancy stages. It wasn't as well refined, and as that technology has gotten more refined and become more mainstream, and as that has become I suppose a form of technology that can be replicated on the black market quite easily, we've seen a pretty big boom in the accessibility for growth hormone generic specifically. And I mean, I think that's definitely played into the reason why a lot of bodybuilders, like you said, are bigger these days. They're running higher doses of growth hormone. We're seeing certain physiological changes that wouldn't have been seen back then. And yeah, obviously genetics were better back then. So if you excelled and succeeded in bodybuilding in the 90s, you had to have the best genetics. You had to be in the 99th percentile. These days, you can be in let's say the 90th percentile, and if you use enough drugs, you can make up for those few percentage of differences in genetics with the absolute elite. I mean, NASA was probably the earliest example of that. From what I heard, it was something stupid, like he used to run 8 to 10 grams of gear a week or something ridiculous like that. And I mean, if you're running that and looking the size he looks, I mean, he was massive. Don't get me wrong, but there were guys just as big as him who were running probably 1/3 to 1/2 of what he was running.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
so it goes to
Nasser was running 750 milligrams of test every day, and he would rotate in his lats up and down, up and down. So yeah, I mean, Flex Wheeler, I would consider Flex Wheeler to probably have the best genetics that ever stepped on a stage, or at least, you know, in the top 5, maybe 10. And so he was 5'7", and he weighed at 225, right? And then Nick Walker, so we were just looking about before, is the same height, and he's 250.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm, you know, and it's no insult to anyone, but I would venture to say Flex Wheeler had better natural genetic ability than Nick Walker. I think that might be a case of increased leverage of other things like growth hormone, right? Like until very recently, I've kind of changed my stance on growth hormone. I feel like it plays a bigger role in this stuff than people think it does. I think using, you know, 1 to 4 units a day might help someone stay slightly leaner. I think really the magic is over 10 units. And a lot of these guys are running nowadays 20 units, 30 units, whatever they can afford. And I think it aids tremendously in growth, more so than most other compounds, right? I would say testosterone might be second there, but I would say growth hormones is huge. When you run big amounts, it's huge.
Definitely, I agree. And I haven't had a lot of experience with high doses of growth hormone. I mean, I had a very intermittent period before I came to Thailand. And yeah, I mean, I saw a night-day difference literally in the time frame of 2 weeks. And I'd love to say it was a placebo effect or that I was just delusional and I was seeing what I wanted to see, but it was a legitimate difference. Like it was definitely a noticeable, conceivable difference. Like I got heavier on the scales and I looked leaner visually. I got fuller, rounder, and I mean I could pretty much just see a night and day difference in such a short time frame. So I mean I couldn't imagine what doing that kind of a dose would do to your physique over the course of say 6 months. Like it would just absolutely mutate you. And especially if you respond very well to growth hormone. I mean, if you're a hyper responder, I mean, you could see you could see a physique change to the point that you look unrecognizable from what you were beforehand. But yeah, I think I agree with you. I think if Flex Wheeler was in like this era of bodybuilding, if he was say born in the 90s and he was actively competing as of right now, he would be bigger than Nick Walker. He would be bigger than a lot of these other guys purely because his genetic response to drugs is clearly superior. His muscle insertions, I mean, I don't think anybody can compete with that. Given how light he was on stage and how big he looked visually, if he had even an extra 15 pounds on him, he would look like an absolute freak.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see here. I mean, those insertions are near perfect, right? I don't think I've never seen anyone with that shape before.
Yeah, it's very rare, very rare.
Yeah. If you look at this one, this is interesting. Someone put this on Instagram earlier today. So I guess if height were equated, Kevin Levrone would be heavier than Chris Bumstead, right? By our
Yeah,
math. But Bumstead is clearly bigger and fuller. I'm guessing a lot of that is from insulin and from growth hormone, right? Because he's weighing in at, what are we guessing? Somewhere between 230 and 240. But he
yeah,
visually, he looks like he's over 250 to me at his height. Bumstead's what, 6'1"?
yeah. 6'1" or just over 6'1". Yeah,
I think that extra 3D look that he has over Levrone is mostly from growth hormone, I would guess, and insulin. He's just able to utilize those carbs and fill up much more without actually moving the scale up significantly, right? Because if that were all tissue, I would have to guess it would move the scale up unless his bone structure is that much smaller.
yeah. Well, yeah. That's the thing. If his bone structure is smaller, I mean, that would play a role, I think. But yeah, outside of that, I think, like you mentioned, growth hormone and insulin would be the biggest needle movers in terms of how he's able to look that big and be that full at that kind of a height. I
Yeah.
mean, we know pretty well if Kevin Levrone is telling the truth, which I think he is, because he seems like a very transparent person. He's spoken about his contest prep drug use in the past and is very minimal. And I don't believe he said he used growth hormone. If he did, it was a very, very low dose, very conservative, like 1 or 2 IUs at the most. But I'm pretty certain he said he never used growth and insulin. He used to use testosterone and nandrolone running into a show, I think.
And then he switched, I believe he switched to Winstrol and Halo Solo,
Yeah,
removed
something.
test altogether. I know a guy who was won one of the state titles in America. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to blow this guy's cover. He was one of the last Mr. One of the states. And he was talking to me about the protocols these guys were using then. And it was very different. Levrone was probably ahead of his time, maybe because of who he was around. He had better coaching and better advice. A lot of these guys were using DECA only in the off season. They never even understood to combine it with test. And so it was kind of, these guys kind of suffered and they had kind of a miserable existence trying to grow. I mean, I couldn't imagine just running DECA alone for a couple months to put on size. Miserable mood all the time, versus the guys
Yeah,
today. There's a lot more, we have a lot more knowledge about how to leverage all these things correctly and the availability. This guy also talked about just the fact that you just couldn't get, if you wanted nandrolone back then, you were getting Oregon, that was it. So if you couldn't find the pharmaceutical stuff, there was no really underground lab stuff in the early 90s, or at least it was any good. Right? It might have been like
yeah,
Mexican veterinary stuff. But you could see what I think is really interesting here too is that Kevin Levrone was considered a mass monster in the 90s, right? Like he ran head to head with Ronnie
yeah.
and all those guys. And
And
Chris
Dorian
Bumstead
Yates.
is the best in classic. And now the classic guys are bigger than the mass monsters in the 90s, or at least for Kevin, which is mind blowing that's the
Yeah,
standard now.
yeah. It's insane. It's crazy to think how far it's come. Because I mean, in terms of actual, I suppose, muscle insertions and stuff like that, like you can't really change much in the way of that. You can just add more size and get more conditioned. And yeah, just to think that the bodybuilders of today, because I think the bodybuilders in the 90's had better muscle bellies a lot of the time and better, like, I suppose, insertions, and that made them look bigger at the weights that they're at. Like,
Yep.
so the fact that the bodybuilders these days look as big as they do, I mean, it's interesting. Like, it just goes to show how much mass they've added to themselves these days in order to just look, I suppose, comparable to those bodybuilders from the 90's that were notably lighter.
Yeah. Like Ronnie was one of the bigger guys, at
Yeah.
least that did
A
very
lot of
well.
people say Ronnie. A lot of people say Ronnie Coleman was like a genetic phenom. I don't think he was as much of a phenom. honestly, Kevin Levrone and stuff were more genetically gifted. I think Ronnie Coleman, it had good genetics, don't get me wrong, very close to like 99th percentile, but probably more 97th, 98th percentile. But he just made up with it by just putting in a shitload of hard work and effort. I think he was just relentless and very, very consistent. Like he just ticked the boxes. I mean, yeah, I think that definitely just filled that little bit of a deficit between him and his competition, where they might have had slightly better genetics and allowed him to come out on top in the end.
Yep. Yeah, in my opinion, again, I have nothing really to back it up. I would say Lee Priest, Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, probably the best in that era, genetic wise.
Yeah,
Probably needed the least
yeah,
amount of chemicals. I think Dorian Yates' genetics are underrated. I think a lot, like he did work very, very hard. I think Dorian Yates was a genetic freak as well. I mean, he gained, similar to Nick Walker, he was putting on at least 10 pounds consistently every single year,
yeah,
which is quite a feat. If you look at Lee Haney said during his reign as Mr. Olympia, he only gained 3 pounds a year average, right? Which is still a
yeah.
lot of muscle when you're that big. But the fact that Dorian Yates was putting on 10 pounds mass every year at that size.
And supposedly being somewhat conservative with his drug use too.
Yeah.
So he's definitely a genetic freak.
Yeah. And it lines up.
And
Sorry.
oh, I was just going to say, and yeah, I agree with you. Like Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, and even I'd say Jay Cutler, like good genetics, really good genetics, like hyper responders, but they had very, very unwavering work ethics. Like they were just workhorses, and I think that definitely helped them out a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some of these guys too, their coaching, the coaches were probably better, but there were probably less coaches and they had slightly more knowledge, at least how to leverage these things. I know a lot of the guys, like when you listen to interviews with Jay Cutler, when he talks about the stuff he was given, half the time he didn't even know what he was taking. I think in one interview he said he'd never used Tren. And then 5 minutes later, he was talking about using Parabol. So these guys were just given things. They took what they were told. They had no idea what they were doing, versus I think the bodybuilders today are more educated in what they're using. It doesn't mean they're using things correctly necessarily, but I think at the top level, the guys are very aware of what's going on, versus back then, these guys were handed stuff by their coaches. Take one of these every other day, take 2 of these daily, whatever, versus I think the guys today have a lot more say over their cycles.
Yeah, I think you're right there on the money. Education is better. Access to good quality information is more widespread. So a lot of the bodybuilders are self-educating these days, and so some of the best athletes aren't just some of the best athletes; they're also some of the most learned athletes, and that goes a long way. I mean, not just in the realm of PEDs, but also the realm of training, nutrition. Our understanding of all of these areas is so much better than it used to be. And I think they all kind of synergistically play a role in contributing to why we see bodybuilders being as big and as lean as they are these days.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And the standard's different, right? I mean, the looks, like even, it's hard to tell in Ronnie here because he's a little washed out looking from the lights. And that was probably this was probably Flex's best appearance ever, right? After that, I think he never quite hit that conditioning ever again. But you can see here, I mean, the conditioning nowadays, the guys are definitely drier, right? Then it's probably using more things like Masteron that wasn't always available back then. Probably more Tren, regardless of what these guys are saying. That most of them are probably using a test propionate, Masteron propionate, and Tren acetate, probably at 100 milligrams a day each. Versus, I don't know what at least listening to what guys like Kevin said, the doses were way different, and the drugs were, Winstrol and Halotestin. Those guys today still use those 2 drugs. They're in addition to the other things, not solo. You can see here with Flex Wheeler. I mean, he looks great, but his conditioning looks slightly off. It could be the picture, but he's definitely wetter. He's not nearly as hard or as dry as the guys today. Like that wouldn't be a placing look. It's like even Nick. I mean, Nick is pretty hard and dry here, especially at his size. 5'7", 250 is massive to come in that big. I wonder too, I don't know much about sight enhancement, but it looks like, to me, I also feel like these guys sight enhance their shoulders significantly.
Yeah.
Like I'm not really sure what's doing this rear delt thing that they all have going on now.
I think it's excessive injecting in those muscles too. Just administering the usual PEDs instead of rotating sites as much, or instead of injecting less frequently and using less total milligrams, they're using more. They need to have more injection sites. They rotate between a few, but they're using them so much more frequently, and they're holding more mils of oil that I think it just leads to a increased rate of scar tissue accrual over time.
Yeah, an inflammatory response or whatever, right? Because it's
Yeah,
obviously not site. I think people misunderstand. It's not, if you inject testosterone into a muscle, it's not actually doing anything for that muscle directly at that point. It will eventually once it goes through systemic circulation, but it's not like it's doing anything outside of causing swelling,
yeah,
which I guess could
exactly.
account for some of this stuff. But that's, like you said,
Yeah.
perhaps it's just constant injecting, constant inflammation, constant scar tissue buildup.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a factor, a contributing factor, and a reason why you might lose striations and lines in a delt, for example, over time. But another thing I wanted to say too is on top of the difference in PEDs is, like you said, I agree with you that a lot of modern bodybuilders are probably using things or leveraging high doses of DHT derivatives like Masteron and whatnot
Mm.
to to get that harder, dry look. I think also from I suppose, a training and nutrition management standpoint or angle, fatigue management's a lot better these days.
Yeah.
Bodybuilders know how to manage fatigue better going into the show, so they're not carrying all this inflammation in their legs from training legs too hard, too close to their show. They know how to approach those days leading up. They don't do stupid stuff like completely cut their water and that sort of thing. They might slowly adjust their water intake or make slight subtle changes, but it's all calculated. Whereas back then, there was more of a mystique to it. They would do things out of superstition and what they were told from their friends, their fellow competitors, and how Joe Blow did his prep or his peak week, and they would basically just use trial and error as their gauge for how they'd peak for a show. Whereas these
Yeah.
days it's a lot more methodical, and we understand and value the importance of managing fatigue better. So there's just less stress in the system, less allosteric load placed on the body in those final few days.
And diet wise, like you brought up diet before, I, something I find fascinating too is nowadays pretty much everyone eats the same, right? Like it's it's probably partly the internet. It's probably over time we've kind of discovered what the same, what works, and we all kind of get to the same place. Now the quantities might vary, and there might be subtle differences in some coaching techniques, but you and I spent most of our lives not knowing each other, right? And we ended up at the same conclusions. Like when you and I talk about diet, we do the exact same things with ourselves and with our clients. I know very few people who do a high fat diet that are successful in bodybuilding. It's not to say there's not a
Yeah,
random guy, but pretty much everyone is doing chicken and rice, and that's, or some sort of meat and rice. It's the same thing across the board. And the techniques are the same, right? The gear usage tends to be very similar as well. And back then, maybe it was lack of internet, maybe it was they just didn't understand stuff, but they didn't. If you look at some of their protocols and stuff, they did similar stuff, but a lot of the stuff varied greatly too, right? Like
yeah,
if you read, especially with their protocols, or at least if they're being honest, what they were using before shows varied. Like we talked about, Halo and Winstrol versus Dory Neats, was Primobolan and Parabolan and Anavar only. But they were on stage next to each other using completely different drugs based
yeah,
on availability and what their preferences were, versus I would be willing to say if you look at the top 10 in the Olympia, they're probably on all roughly the same exact cycle, just varying amounts, right?
yeah.
You
I
probably
agree.
have guys on 10 grams of gear and you probably have guys on 2 grams of gear. The average is probably somewhere in the middle, but it's probably all the same compounds, give or take.
Yeah,
Right? Like some like
definitely.
some like Roman don't use orals, but most of them probably use about the same stuff going in.
I
And also the
agree.
coaching.
Yeah,
I mean, it's probably the same coaches too, right? There's only a couple coaches that have guys on that level.
yeah. Well, there's a handful of coaches that seem to just handle all of those top competitors, and so it'd be pretty rational to assume that they're all using similar protocols, similar framework to their PED design and their training design, their nutrition design. I mean, I know Honey Rambot's very similar with his approach to diet for all of his athletes. And I think training wise as well. He loves his FST7 training. And so a lot of his guys, I mean, I think that's what brings about relatively similar look among all competitors underneath a specific coach is just the, like you said, the similarities, consistency, or the standardization of the training approach, the diet model, and then also the PED design.
Yeah. It's another point. You and I have talked about it before, but I think it's relevant here as well, is the genetic thing and how it dictates the outcome. So I think a lot of guys getting into the sport of bodybuilding have aspirations to become an open bodybuilder or whatever class they want to compete in. And at the top level, I don't believe it's so much where you choose to be. I think it's where your genetics are going to allow you to be within reason,
Exactly.
right? Chris Bumstead might be an exception. I think if it weren't for whatever his underlying health condition is, perhaps he would be an open. He just can't really push the envelope any further at this point. But I think I don't have the genetics to be an open bodybuilder at that level. It just would never happen. Now, perhaps if I had really pushed metrics when I was a younger guy, maybe the outcome would be different, but I still doubt it. Whereas I think a lot of the guys that you see at the pro level in men's physique, like a Ryan Terry, I don't think it's that. And yet now again, that might be where he wants to be. But my assumption is that most of these guys want to move up in classes. They've just kind of tapped out where their ability is. It's not like he's purposely holding back to stay in a weight class. I don't think many guys do that. I don't know what your experience with that is, right? Most guys that I know want to be as big as they can get.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's it. Like a lot of guys, depending on how early they are in their lifting career, they might start off competing in men's physique, or maybe they've built a bigger base, and so by the time they do decide to compete, they jump straight into classic as a starting point. But yeah, usually, yeah, they'll find whatever starting point is suited to them based on their level of muscularity, their structure, and overall symmetry and proportions. And then from there, they just focus on just continually progressing over time. And eventually they, like you said, outgrow a specific category usually, and then they have to move up to the next one. And the way I see it is you've got the first tier being men's physique, second classic physique, and then third being open bodybuilding, whether it be 212 or super heavies. It depends a lot of the time on your height, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Very, very short guys who are, say, 5'4", they're usually I suppose, confined to doing 212s, whereas the guys who are, say, 5'7" and up, they usually, if they can build enough size, they move up to the super heavies. And yeah, I've got a competitor actually at the moment right now, one of my athletes, he competed in men's physique in the past for his first show, and I prepped him for that. And he looked phenomenal. He came first in first timers and first call outs in opens, but he's been putting on a lot of size in his off season. We had a bit of a break between working together, and he came back on board, and he's added a lot of size, and we're going to continue adding more size, and he's going to be doing classic physique next time. And then after that, I mean, who's to say he responds really well, so he might even be in open bodybuilding eventually. But yeah, I agree. It's just that progression, that gradual kind of linear progression over time. We always want more. Like, we're never satisfied. I think you'd agree with me there. I mean, it doesn't matter how muscular we get or how lean we get. We're always looking over the fence at that other side. The grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting theory too, because I always believe that maintenance, like you and I and people that are into this stuff, are definitely a unique bunch. I never understood maintenance of anything in life. I feel like when you maintain, you're basically sliding backwards. Like I don't with my career, with my family, with anything, I always try to push to make things better or improve, right? Same with bodybuilding. It's no different. I couldn't go to the gym and just be like, I'm good where I am. We're just going to stay here. That doesn't make any sense to me. I might as well stop going to the gym.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of that thing. I think the people that get into this sport are never satisfied with anything. And we become very, dysmorphic with our views of the way we look. But I just thought it was an interesting comparison, how much these guys have changed in the last, whatever that is, I guess it's 30 years now, which is wild. Because this is when I started. I started bodybuilding when Kevin Levrone was on the Olympia stage as an amateur. And there was only men's open. That was all there was. There was men's open and women's bodybuilding. All the other categories came out much later to kind of fill the gaps. Were guys that couldn't quite make that size. But I didn't have a choice. I was never big enough, but that was all there was. If you wanted to compete, you were a men's bodybuilder.
Yeah, it's crazy how many categories you got these days.
Yep.
One for every shape and size.
Pretty much, yeah. So I think next you and I can talk about women's wellness or women's PED stuff. Will kind of be an interesting topic to dive into.
a less touched upon topic, so it should be a good one.
Yeah. So Nick is obviously a coach. I will put his link tree and all his information so you get in touch with him down below. Please like and subscribe. And we thank you so much for your support and the opportunity that we have to make some videos for you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.